Hey everyone, it's Jay Wolf here. Today is going to be our part 2 guide of how to build your own desktop PC. And this is where we're actually going to assemble everything. There's many different ways that you can actually go about this. Some people like to go right into the case, get the power supply in there, and start going from there. For my preference, I prefer to get the motherboard all squared away. That's what we're going to do first, is we're going to work on the motherboard and get that all prepared for installation. So for the installation of the motherboard, the first thing we want to do is set up a workstation. Since I currently don't have my own personal workstation, I'm going to use the motherboard box, which is great. One thing to keep in mind here is you want to make sure you don't have any static electricity at all in your heads. They have a wrist guard that you can wear that you'll hook up to a case that's plugged into the wall. Or if you don't really have any issues with where you're at static electricity wise, you can usually go ahead and just touch a metal object, which I have here to the right, to ground yourself. So the first thing we're going to do here is get the motherboard out of the anti-static bag. Do not set it on the anti-static bag, just set it directly on the box, which will work great. And the first thing I'm going to do is install the chipset here. One of the most important parts is installing the CPU. This is one of the areas where many people tend to go wrong when they go into installing something. You want to be very, very careful, especially with the pins here that's in the motherboard. As you can see there, you can see the pins. You got to be really careful with those not to bend. Or a little arm bracket here. What you'll do is you'll just lift up on that, and then this whole thing is going to kind of lift up, and this is your socket right there that you're going to actually install this in. There's a couple ways you can go about on how to install this. There's a little gold arrow here, if I point this out a little bit, that you can see, and there's also these two little notches here that better helps guide on how to install the CPU. And this is 0. You don't want to put any force when you're installing this. It just kind of sets in place. So we're going to line up the notches here, and very carefully we're going to set it in place just like that. It just drops right in and it's in place. And what you'll do is you're going to lower this bracket right here, and then this, when you do press this down, it is going to take a little bit of force. When I first did one of my first builds, I did this and it scared me to death, but it actually is going to take a little bit of force. So you're going to push down on that and it locks into place, and that's it. We've actually officially installed our CPU. As you can see, it's installed there, ready to go. So now that we got that installed, let's step into installing the RAM. So now we're going to get in and install the RAM. One thing to consider here is RAM runs best when it's run on dual channels. So what I do to better help in my installation is you got 1, 2, 3, 4 channels. That's how I do it. So I usually install them in channels 1 and 3 here. So what we're going to do is you just press the little clips up here, and you take out your RAM. Your RAM is not quite as delicate as the CPU. The CPU is a really delicate card, but you always want to be careful with everything on here. And you'll see this little notch here. Can you see that? Great. And there's a little notch here on the motherboard that we can also see. And what we're going to do is I usually try to get one corner down first, and then go ahead and slide the other one down. It will take a little bit of force to put these on. So you just push it down like that and you'll hear a snap right into place. We've installed that one. Push that down into place. Now our RAM's installed. Easy process. So we've zoomed in here. As you can see, the back plate has been put on. Basically what you do is you just line up the holes and you just slide it into place. The best thing with the water cooler is to actually consult the manual. Depending on what your processor type is, has this little sticky tape on there that kind of holds it in place, and then all these slots here will line up with the holes on the back of the motherboard, and it'll help us better screw the... Actually, I can flip this around right now and give you a shot here. As you can see, we have our holes here for the water cooling. And once we get that installed and get it tightened up, it'll fit snug down on our CPU there. Okay, so now before we mount the bracket for the water cooling, one thing that I want to mention is that I've removed the old thermal paste from the water cooler, so I'm actually going to apply a little bit of thermal paste here onto the CPU. And there's many different ways you can do this. You can put a pea drop size on there, and then you can just install the cooler. But this is a difficult cooler to install, so I'm going to go ahead and spread it out. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to put a little pea size drop on there. Try not to make that big of a mess. And I'm going to use the baggie technique. So what I'm going to do is take a baggie with my finger, and I'm actually just going to go on here and spread it out. This is probably a little difficult for you to see, but it's a really easy process. You're just going to kind of spread it out here over the... Okay, so what we're going to do now is go ahead and install the bracket for our water cooler. You can actually do this also if you put it in the case and install it, but I prefer to install this while the board's already setting down. It makes for an easier installation once you get everything in. So you're just going to position it over here and screw it in. You're not going to screw it in all the way, just slightly screw each side in here. Okay, so now we got them all screwed in a certain number of rotations. So now what we can do is we can actually go ahead and install this along with our power supply into the case. So let's jump in, get the case up here, and get that going. So this is actually going to be where we're going to install the motherboard. And as you can see, we already have our standoffs pre-installed. Most cases have them pre-installed, or at least have them started, but you want to pay attention to where your standoffs are on your motherboard. You can draw a sketch of your motherboard and put little dots where all the holes are at, put a sheet of paper underneath it. Or most cases, especially some of the nice Fuller Tower ones, actually have a key down here. So you just look up what kind of motherboard you have, and we have an ATX. So it has ABC, E, F, G, L, M, N. So those are all the places where you're going to need to put your standoffs at. You want to pay particular attention to this because you don't want a standoff poke it through your motherboard, because this will cause it to short out and cause you a lot of grief in the long run. So before we get our motherboard installed, we're actually going to need to install the I/O shield. This is another really easy process that's really simple to do. The I/O shield is going to install, as you can see here. You have these little dimples right there, and you just want to position it in the correct array, which is going to be like this. And what you're going to do is, as you can see, hopefully you can see this, you're going to put the bottom in. You're going to have to put a little force, a little pressure in here, but you're just going to press and snap each side of it down. You'll hear it snap into place. And you want to check with the back, make sure it's all aligned. And it is. And that's it. We've officially installed our standoff here for our motherboard. It's a really easy process. So now what we're going to do is drop the motherboard in. And sorry for being in the way again, but what I like to do is I like to take the motherboard in at an angle. See if I can do it this way so you guys can better see this. But you want to line it up with the I/O shield like this. Okay, so what we're going to do here is I like to put the board in at an angle and line it up with the back I/O shield. And every motherboard's a little different, but once you get things in, you kind of want to pay attention to the back and make sure everything's lined up. And pay particular attention to your standoff, and it kind of falls right into place. So as you can see, the motherboard has correctly fallen into place. All the standoffs, we can actually see the screws for those. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install the screws to hold in our motherboard. Okay, now we've got our screws in. One thing to keep in mind when tightening these, you want to tighten these till they're snug, not super tight, because you can pull the standoffs out of the back of the case, which you do not want to do. So what I like to do is start with one corner and tighten down one corner at a time, doing everything in a cross pattern. This is pretty standard for just about anything, and once you've secure, and that is it. We've officially installed everything on the motherboard, and now we can jump in and start working on everything else. One thing to mention beforehand is actually, where did we get these screws at? That might have been something to go over, but most of all your screws, you end up having way too many by the time you start with the build, but most of all your screws will come with the case. It has usually every screw and more than what you actually need to install everything possible within your case. But sometimes the motherboard comes with screws, the power supply, almost everything will usually come with something to install it. And so you end up having way too many screws, so that's not a big deal, but most of them will come with the case. So the next thing that I like to install after I get the motherboard all installed there is I actually like to go ahead and get the power supply mounted in. This is where we need to kind of discuss your cable management and also your airflow. Once you get the power supply in, you start to kind of get a feel of how you want to manage your wires in this case. I've actually done a build in this case before, so I'm somewhat familiar with how things are wired, but if it's your first time building in a case, it's kind of a hit and miss on, you'll kind of see where things kind of go and work best. Once you get the power supply in, it kind of gives you a bigger picture. And there's a couple different ways you can install a power supply. One is you can have this fan exhausting up into the case, or you can have it exhausting down. Since this case actually has a filter here at the bottom and it's raised, we're going to install this with the fan blowing air down to better keep cool air inside here and blow all the hot air out. So what you do here, it has these rubber grommet feet that we're going to set this on. And it's a pretty easy process. You basically just line up the holes, you set it in there, and you line up the screws here on the back. And then you screw it in. Okay, now we got them all installed, so I'll do cross pattern here like we did before to make sure everything's installed correctly and pulled into place nicely here. And that's it. We've officially installed our power supply, as you can see down here. And you'll see a better way of, this case is really nice that it's got a hole here on the bottom. And what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to route our wires here through the back. Okay, so now we got our power supply installed. And this will kind of give you a better idea of how we're going to manage these wires here. You have your two pins that have to connect into your motherboard, and you can see there's a spot here and a spot here where these have to connect. So now I want to discuss a little bit about installing the CPU cooler. One thing that we're going to need to pay attention to is airflow. How do you want to actually use the air that's coming into your system? What I found best with this system, which I've actually had this cooler installed, is we're going to use this as an intake and shoot air inwards. So we're taking fresh, cooler air from the outside of the case and shooting it inwards to run through the radiator. This is going to help keep the CPU a little cooler. Since we have two 200mm fans here, which is exhausting air, it's going to push air right into here, colder air, and then it's going to go through the radiator and be warmer, but it's going to exhaust right here through the top through these exhaust fans. So that's worked best for me. I had the system running like that before and it worked great. So the first thing I like to do is go ahead and get this first fan installed. One thing to pay attention to is you need to pay attention to your fan headers and where they're going to be positioned at, so you can better hide those so they're not going to be in the way anywhere. Okay, we have those installed, so it's kind of holding the fan in place. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and mount the radiator and screw those in. Now, one thing to pay attention here is this is actually a pivot, so you can actually adjust this and put this any way you want in your case. From what I found is that I like to put it like this. No particular reason, but I found that the wires aren't in the way as much there. What you're going to notice here is that we have all these fan headers. We have two fans on here. We're doing a push-pull configuration, pulling air this way into the case, which is going to exhaust upwards through the two intakes here, or the exhaust fans here. So this actually has a built-in chip that's going to control your fan speeds based on what your CPU temperatures are running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug both fans that I have connected in here into the fan controller. And then this is actually going to plug into the motherboard, the CPU head, but we're going to do that after we get this installed, which this is the most difficult part I found in this type of radiator, is actually installing this. So I pray you guys can see this. Okay, so we're just kind of kneel down here, and what it does is it positions. It actually goes in here. And then it kind of locks in place. And there's a lot of wires here. We're going to hide those once we get done getting this installed. Once I get this installed, I'm going to go through some of the actual wiring that we're going to do here. So now that we've got the CPU cooler installed, as you can see, we can do a little bit more cable management here and start plugging stuff in. What I like to do is there's this little slot here in the back. Hopefully you can see my finger there. And I'm basically going to slide these through here so we can hide those because we don't need them. So now that we got this, and now that we got our CPU cooler installed, and we've already ran our 2 power connectors here for the back, what you do is you want to route them to the closest spot where they're going to connect at. And for our power connector here, this is where you can start playing around with your cable management to better help the system look a little nicer. What we're going to do, this actually has a nice little arrow which tells you basically the way to install it. Okay, so we got that installed, and as you can see, it's nicely tightly managed. The cables here. The only thing that kind of bothers me is I wish this was an all black sleeve here, so we didn't have to see that, because we're going to go with a black and blue theme here on this case, since it's the blue special edition. So one thing I want to mention here real quick is that for our 8-pin power connector for the top of the motherboard, it actually does not reach, focus, it actually does not reach through the back of the case, so we're going to use the nice handy adapter that we got here that came with it actually came with the power supply. We're just going to plug that in right there and run it up to the back of the case so we can plug it in. Okay, so now we've connected another 8-pin power connector. And as you can see here, it was kind of way back here and hard to connect, but when we're always thinking about cable management when we're building a system, you can see we have all these bundles of cables here. So what I'm going to do is actually take a cable tie, and we're actually going to tie these off, which makes it nice. Most people like a nice tidy clean case when they're building a system. So now we're going to jump in and focus on our storage drives. And for our operating system and boot drive, we're going to have the Samsung SSD. And since this is a 2.5-inch drive, we actually use the adapter, the pre-installed adapter that came with this case. And we just basically screwed it in there, installed it, put it in, and we're going to actually install it here on this top drive. And just lock it into place. And we also need to remember that we're going to need to run a SATA and power connector to this. So now what we're going to do is install our 2 SATA connectors for our hot swap bay here. And basically what we're just going to do is we're just going to plug them in. Just like that, and I'm not going to connect them yet, but I'm going to actually just run them here through the back of the case, and then they're going to have to connect right here, so we're going to run it through here, through the side, and we can actually go ahead and connect these. These are SATA 2, and which is fine for this drive. These drives are actually going to be, let's see if we can better zoom in here so you can see this. These are just going to be our hot swap drives that we're going to use, so we can plug these right into the motherboard. on the SATA 2. Two hot swap bay SATA data drives are actually connected. And so now let's run SATA 6 cable from our SSD, which is here in the back. Let's see if I can turn this. Yeah, we're just going to connect right there to the SSD, and we're just going to run this through the same slots that we ran our other drives through. Let's slide this around. Okay, so we just slid this around through here, and these are actually labeled. Hopefully you can see that. Let's see if we can zoom in here a little bit. These are actually labeled with SATA 3 or SATA, and plug it into these white drives. Another thing you might want to consult here is your actually motherboard user manual, just in case you need to go over anything on where to plug stuff in at. Most of it's labeled on the motherboard, so it's pretty easy to go through, but always consult your user guide if you're unsure about anything. So now that we got those connected, now we have to connect power to this system. So what I've done here is I've ran this power connector up to the top of our optical drive, and I'm actually going to leave this here because it's the longest one we have, and it's actually not going to connect here into our SSD drive, so I'm going to have to run a different one into that. But that's okay, we can keep that back there. And we're actually going to have another one here that we can use, that we're going to use. I'm actually going to connect it here to our SSD drive, and then I'm going to leave the rest down here in case there's any other drives that we want to install. We'll already have this pre-installed. That'll make it easier to add them in the future. Into the back of the case like we did before. Plugs right in just like that. Run it through the same exact way here through the bottom of the case. And turn this around again. And what we're going to do is I'm going to run it up against the same wire here. So we can just tie these off with a zip tie and tie them off just like that. So I'm going to plug it in just like that and just tuck this away down here. And actually what I might do, well no, let's hold off on that. But what I could do is I could actually wire tie these down. Actually this is going to fit down in there. So these, as you can see, will be nice and easy to tie down once we get that done. So now we've officially connected our two drives there to power. And another thing we need to do is for our hot swap bay, we've connected the data, but we need to connect a Molex plug here to power the hot swap bays. And this is where we're going to use our other cable that came with our power supply that's got Molex adapters on it. Is plug this into the slot on the power supply again. And I'm going to run this through the back, the same exact spots that I've been running my other cables for power for the hard drives and the optical drive. And plug it right in. So now that we got our storage hard drive installed, what we can do here, I installed this in the top hot swap bay. We just pop it right in and it's installed. So now that I'm here at the back, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to run my data cable from my optical drive. And since this has a toolless design, I'll go over this real quick. But to actually install this, I actually already had it pre-installed. But what you do is you just press this little toolless button here, and it's actually screwed in also, but it'll just pop right out. And to install it, you just pop it right in. You can remove these covers right here if you want to install another one here. So what I'm going to do is I chose a right angle here, and we're just going to connect it right there. And I'm going to run this down the same exact route that I was running my other data cables. That way, so when I tie these down, all my data cables will be in one spot. And we'll run this through right here. It's a great case for cable management. And as you can see, it plugs in right there. Everything's pretty hidden, which makes it nice. So far we've installed everything from our motherboard, which we put in first, and then we went ahead and installed the CPU along with the RAM, and then we put the cooler backplate on and added the cooler. And then we started running some of our wires here for the motherboard, some of our power wires. And then we installed the actual power box here, and we ran all our wires for all our data. Whether it be our DVD drive or our actual storage, SSD and HD or hard drives. So the last thing to install is the video card, and I actually like to hook up these front panel connectors. Those first before installing the graphics card. Actually, you do the graphics card last. I find that's easier considering that takes up most of the slot there in the front. So now let's go ahead and start installing these. So now we're going to connect our front panel indicators and our USB drives actually onto our motherboard. And one thing you might want to look at is actually take a look at your motherboard manual. I am not super familiar with Gigabyte, so I actually had to look into the manual, especially for the HD audio drive isn't anywhere near an ideal spot for it. That's one negative about this board that I found, is that it's not in a very good spot at all. And that's actually going to be the first one we're going to connect. And we have our HD audio right here. And let's see if we can zoom in here a little bit. Right here is actually our HD audio. Usually it's down here at the bottom, so what we're going to have to do is run this actually up through here like that, which I'm not really sure how that's going to work. Especially with, actually, I think I found a way, because we can't run it up through here because that's where the graphics card is going to go. So this isn't really something I want to do, but I think it's something that's just going to have to... Actually, hold on one second. Is run it up here through the back, through this little slot up here at the top, and you cannot see that because the camera's not zoomed out, but that's okay. I'm actually going to run it through here and try to feed this the best I can so we cannot see this. We have our HD audio installed. As you can see, that wasn't as easy process as I would have liked, but it's pretty well hidden behind this CPU cooler, and I can actually tie that off here once we start tying stuff down. For the rest of our front panel connectors, we have a SATA cable, which we're going to plug in right here on the front SATA. Okay, now for our front panels here, what we're going to do is plug in plus and minus for the power LED. And I'm actually consulting the manual for this as we're going, because that's about the only way, without having that front pin connector, that I'm going to be able to actually figure out which ones of these are which. That's our front panel connectors that we've actually connected right there. Like I said, there's a nice little diagram here in the motherboard that I strongly suggest that in any motherboard except for my Asus Sabertooth motherboard actually came with a little connector which worked perfect, but consult your motherboard for anything else. So now that we have basically everything connected, we have all our front panels connected, everything that we need, that we could actually probably power on this system when we plug in the GPU and make sure it's running correctly. So before I actually get into any serious cable management here, that's actually something I want to do. I'm going to install the GPU, and I'm actually going to go ahead and do a boot and make sure this thing posts before I start tidying things up a little bit. And to keep in mind is we actually are going to have 4 200mm fans that's going to need to actually either plug into the motherboard, or we're going to have to run a Molex cable to them. So what I've chosen to do with the fans, since I don't have enough fan headers actually on the motherboard, I went with using the front one and connecting that to Molex, which means it's going to run at full power, which is fine. I didn't want to have the exhaust fans, one running full power, one not, so they're actually plugged into the motherboard along with the one on the side of the case. And another thing to mention that I just saw is for our USB 3.0, there still is no way currently, especially on this motherboard, since it's slightly older, to run the USBs into the motherboard, the USB 3.0. So we actually ran a cable through the back, and we're going to plug them into the back here of the I/O shield. USB connectors here on the motherboard. It's going to power our front USB connectors. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and install the GPU, and I actually want to make sure this system posts. So to install the GPU, all we're actually going to need now is the GPU, and then we're going to have to remove, which I've already pre-removed them, but you're going to have to remove the PCI slots that you're going to need to install it. So we're going to take out the GPU, and we're actually going to remove this protective coating on it. This is brand new, one that I actually purchased. So what you got to do is just line your PCI slot up here with the one on the motherboard. As you can see, there's two running right here, which are going to be for graphics cards. These other ones are for if you want to install a sound card. Just slide it right in, being careful not to poke your motherboard, making sure everything's aligned. And it should just snap right into place. Just like that. So we've officially installed it, and we're going to install our thumb screws to hold it in place. Now we're going to need two PCI connectors. Connect them right there, run them through the back. Again, like we've been doing, to make sure everything is nicely managed cable-wise. Run it up through there, and praying that it's actually long enough. And it is. Looks like barely, but it is long enough. Let's just connect it just like that. That's the first one, and we're going to do the same thing here with the second one. Officially installed power to our graphics card, and now what we're going to do is we're going to actually hook this up to a monitor and see if it posts. Cross fingers. Okay, so now it's going to be the moment of truth. We're going to power this on and see if we get a post. Fans are running, as you can see, which is a good sign. So we've officially gone through post. As you can see, it's a disk boot failure because obviously we don't have an operating system installed. So that's a big thumbs up. That's going to do some cable management here, kind of some tidy up stuff, and then that's going to conclude. Actually, that might be part 3 depending on how long this is. Just doing some cable management, some tie-ups before we actually start installing the operating system. But that's successful post.